Hello, how y'all doing? When the yaho, good morning, or you say evening. How y'all been? 2 weeks I have not done videos. I'll explain. My job has working overtime, which I'm grateful for, because I need all the money I can get to pay these bills and do what I need to get done. Which I like the money, don't get me wrong. Anyway, I'm going to do a video about spearfinger. Now, let me understand, y'all. Let me explain this very carefully to y'all. Okay, so that way y'all can understand what it means. Spearfinger is a woman, a creature, an entity. On her right hand, she has a finger, along with a spear. In her left hand is a heart encased in stone in her left hand. Basically, she looks like an elder woman, but she can shapeshift to any person. She can read their mind and shapeshift to what that person cares about. She eats your liver, meaning she'll get you and sleep your liver out of your body, and you won't even know it out of you. And she's a true event that happened. So yeah, let's go ahead and watch the video, shall we?
Yet among the Cherokee who still remembered the older stories, one warning endured. If an unfamiliar old woman appeared alone from the mountains after sunset, kindness could become the deadliest mistake a family ever made. The settlement sat in a narrow hollow between two long ridges, reached only by a rutted logging trail that turned to mud from October until spring. There were fewer than 20 cabins in total, most of them built by hand from chestnut and oak, each one separated from the next by several acres of steep woodland. Smoke from a neighbor's chimney could sometimes be seen through the bare trees in winter, but in summer, the ridges swallowed every sign of human company. A family could go a full month without speaking to anyone outside their own household. That autumn was harder than most. The men remarked on it during the last of the harvest, when the mornings turned cold earlier than expected and the first frost arrived before the apples had finished falling. Firewood was stacked higher against the cabin walls. Salt pork was hung deeper in the smokehouses. The women stitched heavier linings into the children's coats. Along the logging trails, the last teams of oxen hauled timber down toward the rail spur before the roads froze over, and the drivers spoke quietly about how still the woods had become. There were no crows on the ridges. The deer had moved lower than usual. Even the wind seemed to hesitate at the mouth of the hollow before entering it. A small number of Cherokee families still lived along the upper streams, keeping to themselves for the most part, but trading now and then with the settlers. They brought baskets, dried herbs, and cured hides in exchange for salt, coffee, and iron nails. The exchanges were polite and brief. On one such visit, an elder from among them stood near the porch of a settler's cabin and looked for a long moment toward the high ridge to the north. When one of the younger settlers asked what troubled him, the old man only shook his head. He said a word softly in his own language, then stopped himself before finishing it. He would not speak the name aloud in English. He said only that the mountain remembered things people had chosen to forget, and that a careful family kept its door closed after dark, no matter who stood outside it. The younger settlers listened respectfully, as they had been raised to do, but few of them believed there was anything more to the warning than old habit. They had lived in these mountains their whole lives. They had seen bears, panthers, and lost travelers. They had buried children who had wandered too far, and they had greeted strangers who turned out to be preachers or peddlers or distant cousins looking for work. Superstition, they said, belonged to another century. Still, small things began to change in the hollow that autumn. The livestock grew restless after dark. Cows that had always settled easily into their stalls began pressing against the far walls, breathing hard, as if listening for something on the other side of the boards. Dogs that had been raised to run any trail refused to approach the tree line after sunset. They would follow a scent to within a few paces of the woods, then stop, lower their heads, and turn back toward the porch without a sound. On several nights, a slow knocking was heard from somewhere deep in the timber. It was not the sound of a woodpecker or a falling branch. It came in threes, paused, and then came again from a different direction. Neighbors began locking their doors before sunset, which was something they had never bothered to do before. They told themselves it was only the weather. They told themselves it was only the season. Then a woman no one recognized walked out of the mountains. She came down the North Trail on a Tuesday afternoon, walking without haste, carrying nothing. The first person to see her was a boy sent out to bring in the last of the pumpkins from a field near the trailhead. He said later that he had not heard her approach. He had turned around to lift a full basket, and when he looked up, she was already standing at the edge of the field, watching him. She was elderly, tall for a woman, and dressed entirely in dark clothing that seemed too heavy for the mild afternoon. A long black skirt reached almost to the ground. A wool shawl of the same color was wrapped high around her shoulders and drawn forward across her chest, so that only her face and the fingers of one hand were visible. The other hand remained beneath the shawl at all times, held close against her body as though she were carrying something small and delicate there. Her hair was long, loose, and the color of tarnished silver. Her face was deeply lined, and her eyes were pale, almost colorless. She spoke to the boy in a low, even voice. She asked whether the family in the cabin at the top of the ridge still lived there, and she used their name correctly. She asked after another family on the far side of the hollow, and used their name as well. The boy answered as politely as he could, and she thanked him and continued walking down the trail toward the settlement. By evening, she had visited 3 houses. In each one, she was welcomed inside according to custom. She accepted a chair near the door, but not near the fire. She accepted a cup of water, but not the offered food. She spoke softly, asking about relatives she claimed to be searching for, distant cousins from a family that no one in the hollow could quite place. When the children of the household came near, she watched them without speaking. She smiled at them only briefly, and only when the parents were looking elsewhere. She did not remove her gloves. She did not remove her shawl. The hand beneath it never came free, not once, not even when she reached for the cup of water. She lifted it with her visible hand only, and set it down the same way. When she rose to leave, the family walked her to the door and stood on the porch as she made her way back toward the trail. One of the women noticed afterward that although the ground near the porch was soft with recent rain, the old woman had left no clear prints in the mud. There were marks in the earth where she had walked, but they were shallow and shapeless, as though something lighter than a person had passed over them. That night, a Cherokee elder came down from the upper streams and spoke privately with the head of one of the families she had visited. He did not raise his voice. He did not stay long. He asked whether the woman had been invited to sleep beneath their roof, and when he was told that she had not, he seemed relieved. Before he left, he said one thing quietly and without emphasis. Do not invite her to sleep beneath your roof. He offered no explanation. When pressed, he only repeated himself, and then walked back into the darkness toward the trail he had come from. The family talked about it for a while after he had gone. They agreed that the old man had always been strange about certain things, and that his people carried their own beliefs, and that it was not their place to question him. They locked the door before going to bed, as they had been doing all autumn. 3 days later, one household simply disappeared. The cabin belonged to a family of 4. A husband, a wife, and 2 children, one of them still small enough to be carried. They lived near the western edge of the hollow, at the end of a short spur trail that branched off from the main road. Their nearest neighbor was almost a mile away by foot. They kept a few pigs, a milk cow, and a small flock of chickens. They were known to be quiet, careful people who paid their debts and attended to their own affairs. On the morning of the 4th day after the old woman had first appeared, a neighbor walked over to borrow a length of chain. He noticed as he approached that no smoke was rising from the chimney, which was unusual for that hour. The cow was in the pasture, still tethered to the same post where she had been the previous evening. The pigs were in their pen. The chickens were in the yard, scratching at the dirt as they always did. Nothing about the outside of the cabin suggested that anything was wrong, except the absence of smoke. The neighbor knocked. When no one answered, he knocked again. Then he tried the door and found it unlatched. He stepped inside. The front room was in order. The table was set for a meal that had never been eaten. Bread had been sliced and covered with a cloth. A pot of beans sat on the hearth, cold, with a spoon still resting in it. The fire had burned down to ash. The 2 beds in the back room were made. The children's shoes were lined up beside the smaller bed. A basket of mending sat on a chair near the window, with a needle still pushed through the fabric. There was no sign of struggle. No overturned furniture. No blood on the floor. No missing valuables. The family's small store of coins was still in its tin behind the stove. The husband's rifle was still on its pegs above the door. The children's toys were in their places. Every window in the cabin was latched from the inside. The neighbor stood in the front room for a long time before he went back out to the yard. He walked around the outside of the cabin twice. He checked the smokehouse. He checked the root cellar. He walked out into the pasture and around the pen. He found no tracks that did not belong to the family or their animals. He found nothing at all. By that afternoon, most of the men in the hollow had come to see the cabin for themselves. They searched the surrounding woods in a wide circle, calling out the names of the missing. They followed the small creek that ran behind the property for over a mile in each direction. They looked in the hollows of fallen trees and in the crevices of the rocks along the ridge. They found nothing. It was near dusk when one of them noticed the mark on the wall. It was on the outside of the cabin, on the north face, low enough that a person of ordinary height could have reached it without stretching. It was a single puncture, roughly circular, driven straight into the thick oak plank almost to the depth of a man's hand. The wood around it was not splintered outward, as it would have been from a bullet or a thrown tool. It was pressed inward smoothly, as if something narrow and extremely hard had been slowly forced through the plank and then withdrawn. The edges of the hole were clean. Whatever had made it had been sharper than any knife the men could think of, and stronger than any awl. They stood looking at it for a long time. One of them tried to fit the handle of a hammer into the hole, and the wooden shaft went in nearly to the head. He pulled it out and set it down and did not speak. The Cherokee elder was sent for. He came the following morning. He looked at the cabin, at the untouched table, at the latched windows, and at the mark on the outside wall. He did not go inside. He stood in the yard for a while with his hands folded in front of him, and then he turned and walked back up the trail without saying anything. Some of the settlers went home that evening believing the family had wandered off in the night, confused by illness or grief. Others said perhaps the parents had taken the children and left the valley to look for work. But by the end of the week, no one in the hollow was still saying that out loud. They had all seen the mark on the wall. They had all seen the untouched meal. They had all counted the shoes lined up beside the children's bed. The disappearance was not an accident. Something had come to that cabin, and something had taken the family out of it without breaking a single latch or leaving a single track. The old woman appeared again.
Reason why they disappear while I fight. Spearfinger will hypnotize you, put you in a trance. That's how she gets her prey. That's how she gets her victims. She does that so she don't want to struggle or fight or cause alert or panic. She wants you docile. Basically, she wants you to be like alive, a pet. What she gets is she takes your body. She don't leave you. She knows if she leaves evidence behind, the Cherokees will follow her. Because us Cherokees even have our total stories to kill her on sight. And that's not the only legend you gotta worry about too in North America. Cherokee legend. You gotta worry about stone fodder too. That's another entity that likes to hunt humans too. But back to the story.
again the following night at another cabin on the eastern side of the hollow. She came at dusk, when the light between the trees had already gone from gold to gray. A man returning late from setting traps saw her from a distance, and for reasons he could not explain afterward, he did not call out or step forward. He crouched instead behind a fallen log at the edge of the woods and watched. She was walking along the edge of a cleared field that belonged to a family named Weaver. The Weaver cabin stood about 40 yards from the tree line. A lamp was already burning in the front window. The old woman did not approach the cabin directly. She moved along the border of the woods, slowly, keeping close to the trees, as though she were considering the house from every angle before deciding how to approach it. The man in the woods watched her for what he later estimated to be nearly a quarter of an hour. During that time, he began to understand that what he had at first taken for an ordinary elderly traveler was something else entirely. She was tall. He had not appreciated how tall until he saw her standing beside the low branches of a young dogwood. She had to be near 7 feet in height. Her frame beneath the heavy clothing was gaunt, almost skeletal, with shoulders that were too broad for the narrowness of her waist and arms that seemed slightly too long for her body. Her movements were slow and even, without any of the small adjustments of balance that an old woman would ordinarily make while walking on uneven ground. She did not stumble. She did not shift her weight. She walked as though the earth beneath her feet did not matter. Her face, when she turned briefly in his direction, was calm and deeply lined, and the skin of it was not the color of skin. It was a pale, dull gray, marked with fine cracks that ran along her cheekbones and across her forehead in patterns that resembled the surface of weathered stone. Her hair was long and tangled in the color of ash. Her eyes were pale and completely without expression. Then she raised her hidden hand. She had stopped beside the trunk of a large oak. She lifted the hand out from beneath the shawl slowly, without any sense of urgency, as though she had forgotten for a moment that she was being cautious. The man in the woods saw it clearly in the last of the light. 4 of the fingers were long but ordinary, gray like the rest of her, ending in narrow nails. The 5th was not a finger. It was a spike of dark stone, black as wet obsidian, growing from her hand where the index finger should have been. It was nearly 12 inches long, tapering slowly from the base to a point so fine that it seemed to disappear into the air at its tip. The surface of it caught what little light remained and reflected it back in dull, uneven glints. It was not attached to her hand by any visible joint. It grew out of her, the way a horn grows from an animal. She rested the tip of it against the bark of the oak. Then, without effort, she pressed forward. The stone finger sank into the trunk. It went in smoothly, as though the wood were soft clay, until nearly half of its length had disappeared. She held it there for a moment. Then she drew it back out and lowered her hand, and the tree stood as though nothing had happened, except for a single small hole in the bark where the point had entered. She did this 2 more times, on 2 different trees, at what the man believed to be a comfortable reach from where she stood. Each time the finger passed through the bark and into the heartwood without resistance. Each time she withdrew it slowly and studied the hole she had made, tilting her head slightly, the way a person might tilt their head while listening to a distant sound. Once, and only once, she smiled. She did not seem to know she was being watched. The smile was slight, and it did not reach her eyes, and it was gone almost as soon as it appeared. It was the smile of a person remembering something private and satisfying. Then she drew her hand back beneath the shawl, turned, and walked away from the Weaver cabin, back toward the ridge, without ever going closer to the door. The man stayed behind the log until she was long out of sight. When he finally rose, his legs were stiff from the cold, and he could not feel his hands. He walked home along the main trail, moving as quickly as he could without running, and he did not stop until he reached his own porch. He told what he had seen that night to 3 people. By morning, the entire hollow knew. Whatever the Cherokee had been trying to warn them about was not a story. It was walking through their woods, and it had been walking there for longer than any of them could measure. The warnings, from that point on, became far more specific. The elder came down from the upper streams the following afternoon. He did not wait to be sent for this time. He walked into the settlement openly in daylight, and he asked to speak with the men and women of the households together. They gathered in the largest of the cabins, the one that belonged to a family named Holloway, and they made room for him near the hearth. He was an old man, thin, with white hair tied back at the base of his neck, and he spoke in careful English, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on a steep slope. He said that he had not spoken plainly before because there were things his people did not speak of lightly, and because he had hoped, when he first saw that she was passing through and would not stop. He said that hope had been foolish, and that he had waited too long, and that he was sorry for it. He said that the being they had seen was old, older than the settlement, older than the Cherokee towns that had stood in these valleys before the settlement, older than the trails through the mountains, and older than the mountains themselves in the memory of his people. He said her name only once, and softly, and then he did not say it again. He said that among his people she was known by other words as well, words that meant liver eater, and stone skin, and the one whose hand is hidden. He said that there were rules, and that the rules had been carried down for many generations, and that the settlers should listen to them now as if their lives depended upon them, because they did. The first rule was that no unknown traveler should be invited inside a home after sunset, not fed on the porch, not warmed at the door, not sheltered beneath a roof. Whatever kindness was owed to a stranger could be offered in the daylight and finished before the sun went down. After dark, the door stayed closed, and no voice from outside should be answered. The second rule was that no one should ever be trusted whose hand remained hidden. Not beneath a shawl, not inside a coat, not behind their back. If a person kept one hand from view for longer than a moment, they were not to be allowed near the children, and they were not to be allowed inside the house, and they were not to be turned away from either, because turning them away would only send them to another door. They were to be watched carefully and openly until they left of their own accord. The third rule was that ordinary steel would not harm her. Knives would not cut her skin. Axes would not break it. Bullets, he said, would strike her and fall away like pebbles thrown against a boulder. He said this without emphasis, as though he were describing the weather. The fourth rule was that she imitated kindness. She had learned over a very long time what a weary traveler looked like, and how such a traveler spoke, and what such a traveler asked for. She used these things the way a hunter used a call. She hunted families that lived alone. She hunted at the edges of settlements, where a scream would not carry. She was patient. She could wait for weeks if the waiting served her. The fifth rule was that she had one weakness, and only one. He would not describe it. He said only that it was hidden, and that it could not be reached by force, and that it could only be revealed if she was deceived into revealing it herself. He said that this was not a matter for the settlers to attempt on their own. He said it in a way that made it clear he would say nothing further about it. When he had finished, no one in the room spoke for a long time. Then the men agreed, quietly, that the cabins on the outer edges of the hollow would begin sharing night watches. The children would be kept indoors from dusk until dawn. The trading route up the North Trail would be abandoned until further notice. No stranger would be admitted to any household after sunset, for any reason, whatever their appearance or their story. For nearly a week, the rules held. The settlement, though fearful, held together. Doors stayed closed, watches were kept. The old woman was seen twice more, at a distance, along the ridges, and each time she turned back into the woods without approaching. Then someone ignored every warning. The storm came in from the northwest on the 9th night after the elder's visit. It arrived faster than anyone had expected, and it brought a heavy, wet snow that turned to sleet by the middle of the evening. The wind rose until it was strong enough to bend the tops of the pines along the ridge. The trails filled quickly. The main road out of the hollow became impassable within an hour. Every cabin in the settlement was, for that night, cut off from every other. At the far end of the hollow, in a small cabin belonging to a widower named Corbin and his grown daughter, there was a knock at the door shortly after full dark. Corbin was a stubborn man. He had heard the rules. He had attended the meeting at the Holloway cabin. He had agreed, along with the others, that no stranger would be admitted after sunset. But Corbin was also a man who had buried his wife 2 winters before and who kept his own counsel about what he owed to travelers in a storm. When the knock came, he did not answer at once. He asked through the door who was there. The voice that answered was thin and low and unmistakably that of an old woman. She said that she had lost the trail. She said that her hands were freezing. She asked, very politely, for only a place beside the fire until the wind fell. Corbin's daughter was in the back room. She had heard the voice. She came to the front and stood beside her father and told him not to open the door. She reminded him of the meeting. She reminded him of the rules. Corbin listened to her, and then he looked at the door, and then he unlatched it. The old woman came inside slowly. She was covered in wet snow. Her shawl was drawn tight around her shoulders, and one hand was tucked deep inside its folds. She thanked Corbin in a voice that was almost too soft to hear. She took the chair he offered near the door, and she folded herself into it with the stillness of a person who had been walking for a very long time. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. She sat in the chair. She spoke a few polite words when spoken to. She did not eat the bread that was offered. She did not drink from the cup that was placed near her. The wind outside continued to rise. The fire crackled. Corbin's daughter sat at the far side of the room and did not take her eyes from the visitor. It was the daughter who noticed it first. A log shifted in the hearth, and the firelight rose briefly, and in that moment the shawl slipped an inch or 2 down the old woman's arm. The daughter saw what was beneath it. She saw the gray, cracked skin of the wrist, and she saw the long, dark shape that lay against the woman's side, pointed downward, catching the light along its length like a shard of black glass. She did not scream. She stood up very slowly, keeping her hands where they could be seen, and she walked to the back room. From there, she climbed out the small rear window and ran in the sleet and the wind all the way to the nearest neighbor's cabin 1/2 mile away.
Please save me.
From there, a runner was sent to the Holloway house, and from the Holloway house, another runner was sent up the north trail to fetch the elder. By the time the men reached Corbin's cabin, the door had been closed again from the inside. The lamp was still burning in the front window. They could see Corbin through the glass. He was sitting in his own chair, upright, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes open. He did not turn his head when they called to him. They forced the door. It resisted them for a moment. When they pushed it fully open, they saw a single hole in the thick oak plank, driven straight through from the outside, wide enough for a man's finger. The wood around the hole was pressed inward and undamaged. The old woman was standing in the middle of the front room. She turned toward them slowly. Her shawl had fallen open. The long stone finger was fully exposed, resting against her thigh, its point stained with something dark. Her other hand was still hidden, held tight against her body beneath the fabric. The elder was among the men at the door. He stepped forward alone, and he spoke to her in his own language. He spoke for what seemed to those watching a long time. His voice was calm and steady and even. What he said, none of the settlers ever learned. But at a certain point, the old woman answered him, in the same language, in a voice that was much deeper than the one she had used at the door. And at a certain further point, she lifted her hidden hand out from beneath the shawl and held it open, palm upward, as though offering him something. The palm of that hand was different from the rest of her. The skin there was thin, pale, and untouched by the gray stone that covered every other part of her body. It was the only soft place on her. What happened next took only a few seconds. The elder stepped back. The men behind him moved forward. She understood, an instant too late, what had been done to her. She closed the hand at once, but the moment had already passed. She had been seen. She did not attack. She did not scream. She turned, moving faster than any of them had seen her move before, and she crossed the room in 3 long strides. She struck the rear wall of the cabin once with the stone finger, driving it clean through the timber. She widened the hole with a second strike and a third, and then she was through it and gone, out into the storm, into the black timber beyond the yard. No one followed her. The storm passed before dawn. When the settlers came out of their cabins in the morning, the hollow was buried under nearly a foot of wet snow, and the tracks that led away from the back of Corban's cabin ended within 20 paces of the tree line. There were no further prints beyond that point. The men followed the tracks as far as they went, and then they stood at the edge of the timber for a long time, and then they turned around and walked back. Corban was buried 3 days later in the small burying ground behind the Holloway property. His daughter left the hollow the following spring and went to live with an aunt in a town further east. She did not return. The settlement recovered slowly. The cabins remained occupied. Children were born. Weddings were held. The trading route up the North Trail was eventually reopened, though it was walked more cautiously than it had been before, and never after sunset. The Cherokee families continued to live along the upper streams, and the warnings they had shared continued to be passed on, quietly, from one generation of settlers to the next, as though the warnings themselves were now part of the land. In the years that followed,